Sometimes the greatest mistake is judging a man before learning what he has already sacrificed for his country. The flashing blue and red lights painted long streaks across the quiet Texas highway as the late afternoon sun settled low over the horizon. Traffic flowed steadily in both directions, drivers slowing just enough to glance toward the shoulder before continuing on their way. A dark gray sport utility vehicle rolled smoothly to a stop, its driver responding immediately to the patrol car that had activated its emergency lights less than a mile earlier. Behind the wheel sat Commander Elijah Brooks, a 41-year-old black man whose calm expression never changed as he shifted the vehicle into park and rested both hands on the steering wheel. His navy polo shirt, khaki pants, and simple wristwatch made him appear like any other professional returning home after a long week of work. There was nothing about his appearance that hinted at decades of military service, classified missions, or responsibilities that few Americans would ever know existed. Officer Ryan Mitchell stepped out of his patrol vehicle with measured confidence. At 39 years old, he had spent more than a decade wearing the badge, and experience had convinced him that first impressions were usually correct. As he adjusted the body camera attached to his uniform, he watched Elijah through the windshield before slowly approaching the driver's side window. The evening breeze carried the distant sound of tractor-trailers moving along the interstate, while sunlight reflected softly from the polished patrol car behind him. Ryan stopped beside the open window and spoke in a firm, controlled voice. Elijah looked up with steady eyes and greeted him politely, showing neither irritation nor nervousness. He answered each question clearly, keeping both hands visible exactly where they could be seen. Ryan requested a driver's license and registration. Elijah calmly explained that his identification was inside a leather portfolio resting on the passenger seat and asked for permission before reaching toward it. Every movement was slow, deliberate, and respectful. Ryan watched closely, studying every gesture as though searching for something that justified the uneasy feeling growing inside his own mind. The leather portfolio contained neatly organized documents, business cards, and a government identification holder that remained closed. Elijah handed over his driver's license without offering any additional explanation. Ryan examined the license carefully, then glanced back at the man sitting quietly before him. There was an unmistakable confidence in Elijah's posture, but it was not arrogance. It was the quiet confidence of someone who had faced situations far more demanding than an ordinary traffic stop. Ryan interpreted that composure differently. To him, it seemed almost dismissive. A second patrol unit arrived moments later, parking several yards behind the first cruiser as Officer Daniel Ross stepped out to provide routine backup. Passing motorists continued slowing to observe the growing police presence, and several people lifted their phones for a better look before driving away. Elijah remained silent, his attention fixed on Ryan, who now studied the government identification holder resting beside the registration papers. Without opening it, Ryan asked another series of questions that carried an increasingly skeptical tone. Elijah answered each one with patience, never raising his voice, never showing frustration, and never attempting to explain more than what had been asked. The silence between questions became almost as powerful as the questions themselves. Ryan believed he was in complete control of the encounter. Elijah simply allowed the moment to unfold, knowing that truth never needed to rush ahead of itself. Officer Ryan Mitchell held Elijah Brooks's driver's license between his fingers a little longer than necessary, comparing the photograph to the calm face waiting behind the open window. Nothing about the license appeared unusual. The address was current. The expiration date was valid. The vehicle registration matched perfectly. Even so, Ryan felt convinced that something did not fit. Experience had taught him to trust his instincts, but experience had also become mixed with assumptions that he no longer recognized inside himself. Elijah remained exactly where he had been since the stop began, both hands resting comfortably on the steering wheel, his breathing slow and even. He watched Ryan without challenge or resentment, answering every question with quiet respect. Officer Daniel Ross approached from the passenger side, carefully observing the encounter without interrupting. He noticed the organized leather portfolio resting on the seat beside Elijah, the neatly folded jacket hanging behind the driver's seat, and several travel receipts that suggested a long drive rather than anything suspicious. The evening air remained warm as another stream of vehicles rolled past, their drivers slowing briefly before continuing down the highway. Ryan asked Elijah where he was traveling from. Elijah answered that he had completed official business and was returning home. Ryan immediately followed with another question, asking what kind of official business required so much travel. Elijah smiled politely and replied that he was not able to discuss the details, but assured the officer that everything he was doing was lawful. That answer only deepened Ryan's curiosity. He glanced once more toward the unopened government identification holder lying beside the registration papers. Elijah had made no effort to present it, nor had he attempted to mention his profession. Instead, he simply waited for the officer to decide what information was actually necessary. Ryan interpreted the silence as hesitation rather than professionalism. Daniel quietly shifted his weight and looked toward Ryan, sensing the conversation had begun moving away from a routine traffic stop. The body camera attached to Ryan's uniform continued recording every word, every pause, and every expression without emotion or opinion. Elijah never raised his voice. He never argued. He never questioned Ryan's authority to conduct the stop. His composure seemed almost impossible to disturb, and that quiet confidence gradually became the center of the encounter. Ryan asked Elijah to step out of the vehicle so they could continue speaking outside. Elijah acknowledged the request immediately. Before opening the door, he calmly explained every movement he was about to make, slowly unfastened his seatbelt, stepped onto the shoulder, and stood with relaxed posture beside the sport utility vehicle. The warm sunlight reflected across the highway while the wind gently moved the fabric of his navy polo shirt. Ryan studied him carefully, searching for signs of nervousness that never appeared. Nearby, Daniel noticed several passing motorists looking toward the flashing patrol lights, some lowering their windows for a better view before driving away. Ryan circled the vehicle once, finding nothing unusual inside. Everything appeared clean, organized, and ordinary. Elijah waited patiently, saying only that he hoped they could finish safely so everyone could continue with their evening. Ryan looked back toward him, still convinced there was more to this quiet traveler than the documents suggested. Elijah met his eyes with the same calm expression he had carried since the first moment the patrol lights appeared, revealing nothing except the quiet discipline of a man who had learned long ago that character is often measured most clearly when someone else believes they already know who you are. Ryan Mitchell stood silently for several seconds, watching Elijah Brooks with growing suspicion that had long since moved beyond the reason for the original traffic stop. Everything in front of him suggested cooperation. Every document had been valid. Every answer had been respectful. Every movement had been deliberate and transparent. Yet the quiet confidence displayed by the man standing beside the sport utility vehicle continued to unsettle him. Officer Daniel Ross shifted uneasily near the rear of the patrol car. He quietly reviewed the information that dispatch had already confirmed. The vehicle was properly registered. There were no warrants. The driver's license was valid. Nothing in the system suggested criminal activity or public safety concerns. Daniel looked toward Ryan, hoping the encounter would soon conclude. Instead, Ryan stepped closer to Elijah and asked once again about the government identification holder resting inside the vehicle. Elijah answered calmly that the identification related to his employment and that he would gladly present it if officially requested through the proper procedure. His tone remained respectful, never defensive, never challenging. Ryan interpreted the careful answer as avoidance. The growing audience of passing motorists continued to glance toward the flashing patrol lights while a few nearby drivers slowed almost to a crawl before continuing down the highway. Every passing second seemed to make Ryan more determined to prove that his instincts had been correct from the beginning. He informed Elijah that he intended to continue the investigation until he was completely satisfied with the situation. Elijah nodded once and quietly replied that he would continue cooperating. Daniel noticed the exchange and gently suggested that dispatch had already verified the available information. Ryan acknowledged the comment without changing his decision. He believed there were still unanswered questions, even though he could not clearly explain what those questions were. Elijah remained standing with relaxed posture, his hands visible at his sides, maintaining steady eye contact without displaying frustration. Years of disciplined military service had taught him that remaining calm often prevented ordinary situations from becoming larger than they needed to be. He understood that respect shown under pressure revealed far more about character than words spoken in comfort. Ryan took one final look toward the vehicle before informing Elijah that, based on the circumstances as he interpreted them, he would be taking him to the station so additional questions could be addressed. Daniel looked surprised by the announcement, but he remained professional and quietly assisted in following department procedure. Elijah listened without interrupting. After a brief pause, he looked directly at Ryan and asked in a calm, measured voice, "Officer, are you completely certain that this is the decision you wish to make?" There was no anger behind the question. There was no threat. It sounded more like genuine concern than resistance. Ryan answered immediately, "Yes, I am certain." Elijah gave a small respectful nod. "Very well," he replied. "I will continue cooperating." The conversation ended as quietly as it had begun. Daniel escorted Elijah toward the patrol vehicle while Ryan gathered the documents from the sport utility vehicle. Before entering the back seat, Elijah glanced once toward the leather portfolio still resting inside his vehicle, saying nothing more about the unopened government identification holder. His expression never changed. He simply accepted the moment with remarkable composure. As the patrol car pulled away from the shoulder and merged back onto the highway, the flashing emergency lights disappeared into the evening traffic. Ryan believed the encounter was moving exactly where he intended. Elijah, however, understood that the most important part of the story had not even begun. The patrol car rolled into the parking area of the city police department just as the last light of day disappeared beyond the buildings. The evening shift had settled into its normal rhythm, with officers completing reports, dispatchers answering routine calls, and supervisors moving between offices. Nothing about the arrival seemed unusual to anyone watching from inside. Officer Ryan Mitchell stepped out first with quiet confidence, convinced that he had made the correct decision. Officer Daniel Ross followed a few moments later, his expression far more reserved than before. Elijah Brooks calmly exited the patrol vehicle when instructed and entered the building without hesitation. He looked around the station with the quiet awareness of someone observing every detail without drawing attention to himself. The front desk officer greeted Ryan with a routine question about the traffic stop, expecting an ordinary answer. Ryan briefly explained that additional verification was needed before the situation could be resolved. Elijah remained silent, standing patiently a short distance away. Several officers glanced toward him before returning to their work, seeing only a well-dressed traveler waiting respectfully. After the initial paperwork began, Ryan reviewed the documents one more time, hoping to find something that justified his growing certainty that Elijah was withholding important information. Every record continued to match perfectly. Dispatch confirmed once again that the driver's license was valid, the vehicle registration was current, and there were no outstanding concerns associated with either. Daniel quietly watched the computer screen, wondering why the encounter had reached this point when every available fact suggested that it should have ended beside the highway. Elijah waited patiently until Ryan finally looked toward him again. In the same calm voice he had maintained throughout the evening, Elijah asked whether he might make one telephone call. Ryan considered the request for a brief moment before agreeing, believing there was nothing unusual about it. Elijah thanked him politely and was escorted to a desk where a telephone was available. He dialed a number from memory without hesitation. When the call connected, his voice remained measured and professional. He identified himself simply as Commander Elijah Brooks and briefly explained where he was and why he was unable to continue his scheduled travel. He did not complain. He did not criticize anyone. He stated only the facts and ended the conversation by saying that he would remain fully cooperative until the matter was resolved. The entire call lasted less than a minute. Ryan barely paid attention as Elijah returned the telephone and resumed waiting quietly. For nearly 2 minutes, nothing happened. The station continued operating exactly as before. Then the front desk telephone rang. A dispatcher answered, listened carefully, and looked toward a supervisor before transferring the call. Less than 30 seconds later, another office telephone began ringing. Then another. Within moments, several desks were receiving calls one after another. Conversations became noticeably shorter and more serious. A lieutenant stepped out of his office with a puzzled expression after ending a call that had lasted less than 20 seconds. He immediately asked who Elijah Brooks was. Ryan answered that he was the individual brought in from the traffic stop. Before anyone could continue the discussion, the police chief's direct office line began ringing. The administrative assistant answered, listened without saying a word, and quickly carried the telephone into the chief's office. Silence slowly spread across the station as one person after another realized that multiple calls were arriving from agencies far beyond the local department. Ryan exchanged a confused glance with Daniel, still believing there had to be a simple explanation. Elijah stood quietly near the waiting area, his expression unchanged, knowing that sometimes a single name carried farther than any argument ever could. Chief William Carter stepped out of his office holding the telephone with an expression that none of the officers in the station had ever seen before. The usual confidence in his voice had disappeared, replaced by careful attention as he listened to the person speaking on the other end of the line. He answered only with brief acknowledgments before quietly thanking the caller and ending the conversation. The room remained unusually silent. Every officer nearby sensed that whatever had just happened reached far beyond an ordinary traffic stop. Chief Carter immediately turned toward the front desk and asked Ryan Mitchell to join him. Before Ryan could take more than a few steps, another call arrived. This time it came directly through the secure administrative line reserved for communications with federal agencies. The chief answered immediately. His posture straightened as he listened, offering his name and department before allowing the caller to continue. Several moments passed. Then he simply replied, "Understood. We will fully cooperate." When he placed the receiver back into its cradle, he slowly looked across the station toward Elijah Brooks, who remained seated quietly with the same calm expression he had carried since the patrol lights first appeared on the highway. There was no satisfaction on Elijah's face, no frustration, no attempt to draw attention to himself. He simply waited. Chief Carter approached him personally and introduced himself with quiet professionalism. Elijah stood and returned the greeting respectfully. Before either man could continue speaking, the distant sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the parking lot outside. Several officers naturally looked through the front windows. One dark government sport utility vehicle entered the lot, followed by another. Both displayed discrete federal license plates without emergency lights or unnecessary display. The vehicles parked neatly near the entrance. For professionally dressed officials stepped out with calm purpose rather than urgency. Their appearance immediately changed the atmosphere inside the station. No one raised a voice. No one hurried. Their confidence came entirely from quiet authority. Leading the group was Rear Admiral Marcus Ellison, a distinguished black officer whose service uniform reflected decades of honorable military leadership. Beside him walked two Department of Defense representatives in dark business suits carrying secure document cases, accompanied by a Navy legal advisor. The front doors opened, and the visitors entered with measured professionalism. Chief Carter met them halfway across the lobby. Rear Admiral Ellison introduced himself politely, presented official identification, and thanked the chief for receiving them so promptly. Only after the introductions were complete did he turn toward Elijah. The Admiral offered a respectful handshake and said, "Commander Brooks, I appreciate your patience." Elijah returned the handshake with quiet dignity and simply answered, "Thank you for coming, Admiral." Ryan stood several feet away, unable to understand why a senior military officer had personally arrived for someone he believed was simply withholding information during a traffic stop. Daniel Ross watched the exchange in thoughtful silence, realizing that Elijah had never once attempted to use his position to influence the encounter. He had never mentioned his military career. He had never displayed his government credentials. He had never argued. Rear Admiral Ellison then looked toward Chief Carter with calm professionalism. "Chief," he said, "Commander Elijah Brooks serves in one of our nation's most trusted leadership positions within naval special warfare. His current assignments involve responsibilities coordinated through the Department of Defense and the Pentagon. We are here only to verify his identity, clarify the situation, and ensure that all agencies involved have complete and accurate information." The words settled over the station with extraordinary weight. Ryan slowly lowered his eyes toward the floor as the quiet confidence he had carried throughout the evening gave way to the first unmistakable realization that he had misunderstood the man standing before him from the very beginning. Rear Admiral Marcus Ellison allowed several quiet seconds to pass before speaking again, giving everyone inside the station time to absorb what had just been revealed. The room had changed completely. Only minutes earlier, Elijah Brooks had appeared to be an ordinary traveler answering routine questions during a traffic stop. Now every officer understood that they were standing in the presence of a man whose career had been dedicated to protecting the nation in ways that would never appear in newspapers or public ceremonies. The admiral placed a slim portfolio on the conference table and opened it with deliberate care. Inside were official documents verifying Elijah's military status, current assignment authorization, and federal credentials. Chief William Carter reviewed each page carefully, occasionally looking toward Elijah with growing respect. Everything matched perfectly. Every record confirmed exactly what the admiral had explained. There had never been any attempt to conceal unlawful activity. Elijah had simply honored the confidentiality required by his position. Ryan Mitchell stood quietly near the doorway, listening as the admiral continued. He explained that Commander Brooks had spent more than 2 decades serving the United States through demanding assignments that required extraordinary discipline, leadership, and discretion. Much of that service would never be discussed publicly because protecting sensitive operations was itself part of the mission. The admiral emphasized that Elijah had never expected special treatment because of his position. On the contrary, he had chosen to cooperate fully with every instruction throughout the entire encounter. Daniel Ross slowly nodded as he replayed the evening in his mind. Elijah had answered every question respectfully. He had moved only after explaining his actions. He had remained patient through every delay. At no point had he attempted to influence the situation by mentioning his military career or requesting recognition. Chief Carter closed the portfolio and looked directly at Elijah. "Commander Brooks," he said sincerely, "I appreciate the professionalism you have demonstrated throughout this entire situation. Your conduct reflects the highest standards of public service." Elijah offered a small, respectful smile. "Chief, I believe every professional carries the responsibility to remain respectful, especially when circumstances become difficult. That responsibility belongs to all of us." His answer settled quietly over the room. There was no pride in his voice, no accusation, only calm conviction. Ryan finally looked up and met Elijah's eyes for the first time since the federal officials had arrived. The confidence that had once filled his expression had been replaced by reflection. He understood that he had judged a man before truly understanding him. He had mistaken quiet confidence for defiance and professional discretion for suspicion. Rear Admiral Ellison gathered the documents before adding one final observation. Leadership is not measured by how people behave when everything is easy. Leadership is revealed by how they treat others when they believe no one important is watching. The words lingered in the silence that followed. Even the officers completing paperwork nearby had stopped to listen. Chief Carter slowly nodded, recognizing that the lesson reached beyond a single traffic stop. It spoke to every decision made while wearing a badge or a uniform. Elijah thanked the admiral for coming and expressed appreciation to everyone who had handled the verification professionally once the facts became clear. He asked for no recognition and requested no special consideration. His only concern was returning home after a long day of service. As the federal representatives prepared to leave, Ryan remained standing in thoughtful silence, realizing that the greatest authority in the room had belonged to the one person who had never felt the need to prove it. After the federal delegation departed, the station remained unusually quiet. The familiar sounds of keyboards, ringing telephones, and conversations slowly returned, but the atmosphere had unmistakably changed. Chief William Carter asked Officer Ryan Mitchell and Officer Daniel Ross to join him in the conference room. Elijah Brooks accepted an invitation to remain for a few more minutes while the immediate review began. No one raised a voice. No one pointed fingers. The purpose was not humiliation. The purpose was understanding exactly how an ordinary traffic stop had become a lesson that reached far beyond one department. Chief Carter placed Ryan's completed incident report beside the body camera recording and invited everyone to review the events from the beginning. The video showed Elijah pulling over immediately after the emergency lights activated. It showed his hands resting on the steering wheel exactly as instructed. It showed him asking permission before reaching for his documents. It showed every answer delivered respectfully and every movement explained before it happened. The recording also captured every decision that followed. As the footage continued, long periods of silence filled the room. Ryan watched himself asking the same questions repeatedly even after dispatch had confirmed that Elijah's identification, registration, and driving record were completely valid. He listened as Daniel gently reminded him that nothing in the record suggested criminal activity or any threat to public safety. He watched the moment Elijah calmly asked whether Ryan was certain about continuing the encounter. Looking back now, Ryan understood that the question had never been a warning. It had been an opportunity to pause, reconsider, and let facts guide judgment instead of assumptions. Chief Carter finally stopped the recording. He folded his hands together and looked around the table before speaking. He explained that accountability was one of the foundations of professional policing. Every officer carried significant authority, but authority achieved its highest purpose only when balanced by fairness, patience, and sound judgment. Decisions could never be based on appearances, personal impressions, or assumptions that could not be supported by objective facts. Ryan listened without interrupting. The confidence that had guided him earlier had been replaced by sincere reflection. He turned toward Elijah and spoke quietly. "Commander Brooks, I owe you an apology. You treated me with respect from the very beginning, and I allowed my own assumptions to influence my decisions instead of relying on the facts in front of me. I regret that." Elijah met Ryan's eyes with the same calm expression he had carried throughout the evening. "Officer Mitchell," he replied, "every professional makes difficult decisions. What defines character is the willingness to learn when those decisions reveal something about ourselves. I accept your apology, and I hope this experience strengthens everyone who serves this community." Daniel nodded thoughtfully, recognizing that Elijah had chosen reconciliation over resentment. Chief Carter informed Ryan that the incident would undergo a formal administrative review according to department policy and that additional training would be scheduled for the entire agency, so every officer could benefit from the lessons learned that evening. Ryan accepted the decision without argument. He understood that accountability was not punishment for its own sake. It was an opportunity to improve public trust. As Elijah prepared to leave the conference room, he shook hands with Chief Carter, then with Daniel, and finally with Ryan. The handshakes were simple, respectful, and sincere. Walking toward the station exit, Elijah carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had defined every moment of the encounter. Behind him, the officers remained standing in thoughtful silence, fully aware that the most important lesson of the evening had not come from rank, authority, or reputation, but from the steady example of a man who never allowed another person's assumptions to change his own character. Several weeks passed before Commander Elijah Brooks returned to the police department, but this time he arrived through the front entrance as an invited guest rather than an unexpected visitor. The training room had been prepared early that morning, with rows of officers from every shift seated beside supervisors, field training officers, and department leadership. Chief William Carter believed that the most valuable lesson would not come from another policy manual or legal presentation. It would come from hearing directly from someone whose professionalism had remained unshaken during one of the most difficult moments of his career. Officer Ryan Mitchell sat quietly near the front of the room, his notebook already open long before the presentation began. He no longer viewed the upcoming meeting as another required training session. Instead, he saw it as an opportunity to become the officer he had once believed he already was. Elijah entered wearing a simple Navy business suit rather than a military uniform. Nothing about his appearance suggested rank or prestige. He greeted everyone with a warm smile and thanked the department for inviting him. Standing before the audience, he never mentioned awards, classified assignments, or accomplishments. Instead, he spoke about responsibility. He explained that every profession built on public trust carried extraordinary influence over the lives of others. Whether someone wore a military uniform, a police badge, or worked in any public service role, each decision had lasting consequences far beyond the moment it was made. The room remained completely silent as Elijah described the importance of slowing down when emotions or assumptions threatened to move faster than facts. He reminded the officers that every person encountered during a traffic stop carried a life story that could never be understood in the first few minutes of an interaction. Respect, he explained, did not weaken authority. Respect strengthened it because it allowed sound judgment to replace unnecessary conflict. Daniel Ross listened carefully, Recognizing how closely Elijah's words reflected the calm example he had witnessed on the highway weeks earlier, Ryan wrote page after page of notes, realizing that the greatest lesson had nothing to do with military service or federal authority. It was about character. During the question and answer session, one young officer asked Elijah what had allowed him to remain so calm throughout the encounter. Elijah smiled gently before answering that discipline was not something a person suddenly discovered during difficult moments. Discipline was built through thousands of ordinary choices made long before those moments arrived. He explained that people could not always control how others treated them, but they could always control the dignity with which they responded. Chief Carter thanked Elijah for sharing his experience and announced several new training initiatives focused on communication, impartial decision-making, and procedural fairness. He emphasized that the department would continue learning because public confidence depended upon officers who remained committed to growth throughout their careers. As the session concluded, Ryan approached Elijah privately. He thanked him once again for accepting the invitation instead of declining it. Elijah shook his hand warmly and replied that communities became stronger whenever honest conversations replaced pride. The officers slowly left the training room carrying notebooks, thoughtful expressions, and a renewed understanding that true professionalism was measured not by the authority someone possessed, but by the fairness, humility, and respect they demonstrated every time they chose to serve another person. Several months later, the same stretch of Texas highway looked almost unchanged. The afternoon sun still stretched long shadows across the pavement, freight trucks continued their steady routes, and families traveled toward home after another ordinary day. Yet for Officer Ryan Mitchell, everything about the road felt different. Experience had reshaped the way he viewed every encounter, reminding him that every person behind a steering wheel carried a story invisible to first impressions. During his patrol that afternoon, a dark sedan passed his cruiser with a broken taillight. Ryan activated his emergency lights, and the driver safely pulled onto the shoulder without hesitation. As Ryan stepped from his patrol vehicle, he paused for a brief moment before approaching. He remembered another roadside stop months earlier, another calm driver, and another opportunity that he had failed to recognize. This time he chose to let facts lead before assumptions. He greeted the driver politely, introduced himself, and explained the reason for the stop in a calm, respectful voice. The driver responded with equal courtesy, thanked Ryan for the explanation, and provided the requested documents after clearly describing every movement. The exchange lasted only a few minutes. Everything checked out correctly, and Ryan issued a simple written warning for the equipment violation along with information about repairing the taillight. Before leaving, he wished the driver a safe trip home. The driver smiled, thanked him sincerely, and continued down the highway. Unknown to Ryan, another vehicle had quietly slowed in the distance before continuing past the scene. Behind its windshield sat Commander Elijah Brooks, returning from another assignment. He recognized Ryan's patrol vehicle immediately, but chose not to stop. Instead, he observed the interaction from a respectful distance. There were no raised voices, no unnecessary questions, and no misplaced suspicion. There was only professionalism, patience, and mutual respect. Elijah smiled quietly to himself before continuing his own journey. Later that week, Chief William Carter reviewed the department's newest community feedback reports. Public comments describing respectful interactions with officers had steadily increased. Complaints had declined, and participation in community outreach programs had grown stronger than at any point during his tenure as chief. The training sessions had become a permanent part of the department's professional development program, reminding every new officer that authority earned public trust only when exercised with fairness and humility. Ryan often thought back to the evening that had changed his perspective. He no longer viewed it as the worst day of his career. Instead, he recognized it as the day he truly began becoming the officer he had always hoped to be. Daniel Ross continued serving alongside him, noticing the difference not only in Ryan's decisions, but also in the confidence that now came from careful judgment rather than unquestioned certainty. Months earlier, one quiet man had chosen dignity instead of resentment, patience instead of pride, and character instead of confrontation. That choice reached beyond a single traffic stop and quietly transformed an entire department. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, The highway carried thousands of travelers toward destinations known only to them. Some wore business suits. Some wore uniforms. Some carried responsibilities no stranger could ever imagine. Yet every one of them deserved the same measure of fairness, respect, and humanity. Because the strongest symbol of justice is never a badge, a title, or a uniform. It is the simple decision to see the person before making the judgment.